Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Emeritus Lee Martin McDonald. Lee Martin McDonald received his Master's of Theology from Harvard University and his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. He has studied at many institutions, including Cambridge University, England, Heidelberg University, Germany, and Harvard University. He is a professor of New Testament studies and president emeritus at Acadia Divinity College and former dean of the Faculty of Theology at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. He has taught New Testament studies at Acadia Divinity College, Sioux Falls Seminary, Fuller Theological Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary in 2007-2008 as a visiting professor at Chapman University, and lectured in a variety of graduate institutions in Canada, the USA, Athens and Greece, Budapest, Hungary, Prague, and elsewhere. He has also served for 6 years as president of the Institute for Biblical Research, a community of around 1,000 Old and New Testament scholars. He was a U.S. Army chaplain, a pastor for 18 years, and has served on the boards of directors for 3 graduate schools of theology. He has written and or edited more than 30 books and written more than 150 articles and essays on biblical subjects, as well as on practical issues for the church. Dr. McDonald is a member of the prestigious Studiorum Nova Testamentum Societas and the Society of Biblical Literature. He is an American Baptist minister and regularly lectures at various institutions and preaches or speaks in many denominational churches on biblical subjects, including how the Bible came to be and also what biblical scholars are saying about Jesus. He often addresses the question of the relevance of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient non-biblical resources for understanding Jesus in this context in various passages in the New Testament. He is a specialist in the context of early Christianity and the origin of the Bible, and the formation of both the Old and New Testaments. He was also president of the Institute for Biblical Research from 2006 to 2012. Welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Lee Martin McDonald.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you here. And today's discussion is going to be based upon his book, The Biblical Canon, Its Origin, Transmission, and Authority. The link to purchase this book will be in the description below. So I'd like to get us started off with this question. How do we first start hearing about written books of the Old Testament?
You find a number of written books that are now lost that are found throughout the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And you find some in the Pentateuch or the Torah, and then others throughout the historical books as well as the prophets that are mentioned. There's 21 books that, and it could be 26 because some might possibly be referenced to separate books, but I have a list of those. I can send them to you if you want, but they are lost books, but several of them were attributed to seers or prophets. And so those were, and they were cited as authorities on the subject that the authors were dealing with in the Hebrew Bible. But we don't know what those books were. We haven't got them. But you do start seeing references to, I mentioned one of the first collection or canons in the Hebrew Bible is actually 3 events, the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, and the entrance into the land of Canaan. Those are cited some 85 times. James Sanders, a good friend, recently passed away, has put together a book on all of the references to that in the Hebrew scriptures. And those are cited by the prophets. And one example, and there's 85, is Amos chapter 2, who cites the Israelites for and speaks against them because they're not remembering that God brought them out of the land of Egypt and through the wilderness and so on. Those are the kinds of things that become prominent in the life of the ancient Israelites. And but as far as being referring to a particular book that's now in the Hebrew Bible, that comes considerably later. And the Old Testament portion or Hebrew Bible portion that was always prominent was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. But that begins to take place in the time of Josiah, 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23. And that led to a renewal of faith in the Israelites. And you don't see much after that, except after the deportation, the Babylonian captivity of Jerusalem, 586 BC. You see around 500 to 450 BC, Ezra and Nehemiah, they come back to the land of Israel, and they are citing the books. All 5 books are found in Ezra and Nehemiah, and but also a reference to Jeremiah and to Malachi, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. So you start seeing references to books at about that time. Josiah, about 620, 621 BC, and then at that period of time, the Israelites lost their capital, their kingdom, their kings. The only thing they had with them in Babylon was the law, the Torah. And that's what they focused on from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah thereafter. But the list of books began to grow, and by about 283, there's a translation of the Pentateuch, and it's found in the famous legendary writing, the Letter of Aristeas. And that was probably written about 130 BC, and it mentions in there a number of things, but the sacredness of those books that were translated, it was the Pentateuch only. Excuse me, I will turn this off. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, I have to leave it on and check the number. My wife is an invalid right now, and so I always have to be in contact with her. I'm sorry.
No problem.
But by the time of Sirach, about 180 BC, you start hearing references to the law and the prophets, and then the others. What are the others? Could they have been that third part of the Hebrew Bible, as many scholars say? I say we really don't know, because the books are not identified for what was prophets. And in the New Testament, the Psalms were called the law, and also prophets. They're interchangeable. And so a number of the books that now reside in the Ketuvim, or the Hebrew third part of the Hebrew Bible, those were interchangeable for quite some period of time. In the distinction of the 3 parts, the first time you see it is about 180 CE in the Common Era, and then you don't see references to more than the law and the prophets well up into the 4th, 5th century in the Talmudic literature. And so there was a great deal of, I'm going to just turn this machine off. Yeah, the Talmudic literature was still debating certain books, Ezra, Ecclesiastes, Ezekiel, and even Sirach itself was called scripture a number of times in the Talmudic literature. And so there was debates. It was fluid. The canon was fluid. And I often refer to the Dead Sea Scrolls as a marvelous resource of the, now most scholars are saying it's about 1,000 manuscripts discovered there. At first they said about 900, but now it's at about 1,000. But over 200 of them are the books of the Hebrew Bible, but over 700 of them are of other books that informed the faith of probably the Essene Jews, but those were not created by the Essene Jews. They were brought to them. They were transformed, excuse me, that's not the term I'm looking for. They were brought by other Jews into that community, but most of the texts were not what we call sectarian texts that were created at Qumran, but the majority of those books have long since passed, though we have them from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the early Christians, who were also Jews, they adopted the sacred texts of the Jews before their separation. And that adoption included some of the books that are found at Qumran that we now call deuterocanonical books or apocryphal books. So I don't know if I'm getting into the weeds on your question here, but I'm trying to give a little bit of a focus. But you don't really have the first listing of the books of the Hebrew Bible is about 180 to 200 CE. And for the Christians, you start seeing something similar at about 180 CE by Irenaeus and also Melito of Sardis. So those are the kinds of things that took place for centuries. And a part of what I've been trying to say for years is that the formation of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, was very fluid for several centuries. And to this day, all Christians do not agree on the full scope of their Old Testament. The Catholics have a larger one than the Protestants, and the Orthodox have a larger one than the Catholics. But all of the major church denominations agree on the books of the Hebrew Bible, which is interesting. But those were not settled for quite some time, and well into the 4th century, there were Jews that were questioning the authenticity or the sacredness of Esther, and they did not include it in like they do now in the reading at Esther at Purim. But there's several church fathers, Athanasius, 367, he excluded it from his Old Testament scriptures. So those kinds of things varied for a number of years. But feel free to jump in if I'm going aside from your question. But there was no early fixed collection of Hebrew scriptures, Old Testament scriptures, or even New Testament scriptures well into the 4th, 5th centuries. And the New Testament had some variances in churches well into the 1800s with the Armenian Christians who adopted 3rd Corinthians. So,
what does the Prologue to Sirach tell us about the formation of the Hebrew Bible?
It tells us it was written by the grandson of Sirach, probably around 130 BCE. And it says that there was a collection of law and prophets and others. We don't know what comprised the prophets, and we don't know what comprised the others. Could it have been some of the writings that were found at Qumran that didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible? It could have been. But there are those who are pretty dogmatic that that was the third part of the Hebrew Bible. The first time you see a specific reference to a third collection in early Christianity, which was Jewish Christianity, you find in Luke 24:44, where Jesus comes, the risen Christ comes, and he tells the disciples what must take place in the law and the prophets and the Psalms. But there are some that said, well, that's 3 parts right there. But go ahead and look back at verse 27. Jesus said to those disciples on the road to Emmaus, he told them all about himself from all of the scriptures, the law and the prophets. Only the law and prophets are mentioned. So law and prophets was the most dominant means of referring to the Hebrew scriptures. It's all but one time in the New Testament, it's law and prophets or simply the law of Moses that's mentioned. And you find that in the early church fathers as well. But the prologue is a very good statement that by the time of 130, clearly there were 3 collections, the law and the prophets, but we don't know the parameters of it's pretty clear. Most scholars agree that the law was pretty well settled by that time, the 5 books, the Pentateuch for Christians. But the law, the prophets, we don't know what it comprised of, and it varies even in the New Testament times. And the rest of the others, could those have been some of what we now call the pseudepigraphal books or the deuterocanonical books or apocryphal books. They might have been, because some of those books were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's nobody that itemizes which books were sacred and which were not before the time of Jesus. And really, it only starts about toward the end of the 2nd century for both Jews and Christians. And likely, Melito, who goes to Palestine to find them from Sardis, he likely connected with some Jewish Christians or Jewish teachers at the time to find out which books were, and he lists most of those that comprise the Hebrew Bible, with a couple of exceptions. But yeah.
What about rabbinic literature? Does it help us understand the formation of the Hebrew Bible?
I think so. In a number of places, the first listing, as I shared with you, is the Baba Batra 14b. That's rabbinic literature. It may have dated from the end of the 2nd century, but it was not included in the Mishnah, the oral tradition, the oral law that was circulating among the Jews. It was not a popular text and doesn't have any other parallels, but it is included in the Babylonian Talmud. And there's a number of things that are very helpful. One has to be careful when one looks at, I know some scholars that have everything the rabbinic said, and they're really dating 2nd century, the Common Era, and thereafter. Everything that they said about the period of time in which the church was born is true. Well, that's not necessarily the case. What they said perhaps about the Shammai or Hillel, yeah, I take their word on that. Hillel probably came, I think, from Babylon, and he may have been very instrumental in shortening the collection of books that could be read in the Jewish gatherings. But there's a lot of great value, and I look at, there's a terrific New Testament scholar who happens to be Jewish, and I was just thinking of her book here, the New Testament, and dealing with the Jewish background, and her name just slips me for a moment, but Amy Jill Levine, you may well have known her, and if you didn't, you should. But she's put together this Jewish annotated New Testament and has brought together.
I have that.
Oh, yeah, it's a terrific text. And also the most recent English translation of the Strack and Billerback collection of Jewish understandings of the New Testament period. Those are some valuable resources. So I don't hesitate to recommend. A good friend of mine said on one occasion to a group of folks who were, quote, New Testament scholars, and they wanted to study their Greek. And he said, do you know which language Jesus spoke? And of course, Aramaic and likely could read Greek, or rather Hebrew. And he said, why don't you get around to reading the language that Jesus spoke and the earliest Christians did? And I think you'll find some pleasant surprises in what you find in that. So I'm not at all opposed to the rabbinic sages. I think they have to be, like all 2nd century literature, even in the Christian literature, they sometimes see their own present realities and they want to push them back into the 1st century at the time of the birth of the church or the stories of Jesus. So one has to be careful with how one reads it. Historically, Jews and Christians have been anachronistic in their assessments of ancient literature, and they breed a 4th century document. Surely that's what was true in the 1st century, and sometimes it wasn't so necessarily.
And when does the Hebrew Bible become stabilized?
Certainly by the end of the Talmudic period, but as late as the 4th, 5th century of the Common Era, you still find some fluidity, debates over some of the books. Of course, Song of Songs, and then one rabbinic sage said, you know, that was the holiest of the holy books. And but not everybody agreed with that sage at the time. So there was fluidity for quite some period of time. By the time of the Masoretics, who are putting vowel points on the Hebrew text, or they're making copies of it, it's pretty well settled. But not necessarily. There were two Jewish scholars at Princeton a few years ago, Audrey, I'll think of his last name in a moment, but they wrote about what we often think of: whatever the sages said, all Jews everywhere said. But there were no Tosefta, Jewish schools, to the west, and sometimes to the north, and sometimes to the south. And so the scriptures that they had were the Greek scriptures that sometimes included other books. And they say until about the 8th to the 9th century, there was no unity among the Jews on what books comprised their sacred scriptures. That was true earlier for the Jews in Israel and to the left of the, I'm looking at the map of Israel and going to the left all the way to Babylon, but going east. And from the land of Israel to Babylon, there was a great deal more consistency in the books that were read among the Jews. And but it varied considerably outside of that for centuries. Aria Edry and Doran Mendels wrote a terrific collection of articles on that, and we participated in a similar conference, and I asked them for a copy of their paper, and they graciously gave it to me, and it came out in publication, the Jewish Publication Society. So there was fluidity in the formation of the Hebrew Bible for centuries, but that's also true in the Christian Old Testament.
I would now like to shift to the New Testament. When do we begin to start seeing a formation of the New Testament?
Well, the foundation of the New Testament was always Jesus. And you don't start finding a formation of the books that comprise the New Testament, the books that are the Christian Testament, that until really around the 4th century. You see some of it in Origen in the 3rd century. He's more familiar with the Jewish scriptures, and he makes a list of those, but he's very much open to fluidity. And there were questions among the Christians well into the 4th, 5th century of the Common Era. And I had noted earlier, well into the 1800s for the Armenian Christians, who added 3rd Corinthians and also the repose of the blessed disciple, the death of John the Apostle. And that was true in their Bibles until the early 1800s. And 3rd Corinthians circulated in some Catholic manuscripts, scriptural manuscripts, for almost 1,000 years. And 3rd Corinthians is a 4th century document, probably could be as early as the end of the 2nd century, but it wasn't 1st century and it wasn't written by Paul. The Syrian Christians varied in the books that they accepted. They rejected what's called the minor New Testament epistles, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude, as well as the book of Revelation. And they rejected that for centuries, 5, 6 centuries, and the book of Revelation was not welcomed by the Orthodox Christians until about the 7th century. And to this day, though it's in their Bible, they never read it in their liturgies, which is interesting. I've given some lectures in Moscow and also in Athens, and we focused on the Orthodox scriptures in both. One's the Eastern Orthodox, and then the Russian Orthodox, and then the Oriental Orthodox, which is the Syrian. And they varied in the books that they had for centuries. I'm just trying to think right through the up until about 1000 CE, there were variations in the manuscripts that continued to circulate the Christian New Testament. Sometimes people in a New Testament textual critic who's since passed shared it with me, and I published it in the Canon Debate volume, that the first time you see a manuscript with all of the New Testament books in it and no others is about 1000 CE. There in the 4th century, you'll see all of the books of the New Testament in Codex Sinaiticus, but also you see the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas added on without any distinction. So that varied for quite some period of time, and the fluidity in their Old Testament also continued on in their New Testament for quite some period of time. The word canon was never used of those collections up until Athanasius first cites it in the 4th century. Origen makes a similar statement, but it wasn't very popular, and he didn't limit the books like Athanasius did. He was a church father from Alexandria, and he gave a festal letter to tell people when to celebrate Easter. And in the 39th festal letter, he listed the books that could be read in the churches, and the ones that could be read privately but not in the churches, and then those that he said were heretical and should not be read at all. So that's you begin to see lists of canons really in the 4th century. And if you want to ask about the Muratorian fragment, I'll be happy to deal with that if you want to deal with it.
Sure.
Okay. I've got to turn this thing off. I'm getting all kinds of stuff that are popping up here. The Muratorian fragment has been touted as a 2nd century document, and it lists the books of the New Testament. And in that listing, in its fragment, it doesn't have the first 2 Gospels in it, but it does list the others and the rest of the books of the New Testament. But it also puts, interestingly, the Wisdom of Solomon in it, and it's in a New Testament list. The only other time that we find that ever is in the late 4th century with Epiphanius of Salamis. And it mentions that Hermas was the brother of Pius in that text. And the only other references to that are at the end of the 4th century, early 5th century. It mentions Miltiades as somebody whose writings you should avoid. There was something wrong with him, but he's praised in the 2nd century, early 3rd century by Tertullian, and also by Eusebius in the 4th century for standing against the heretics of his day. There's no parallels to the Muratorian fragment until you get to the 4th century. And I put all of the canon formations, the lists of canons in the 4th century. The closest parallels to it are in the 4th century. And then you see them, the first council, they were all local councils, by the way, was the Council of Laodicea. It was not ecumenical. There's no ecumenical council that dealt with the books of the Bible. After the Council of Nicaea in 325, you start seeing lists. But the reason that it was important was there was broader agreement on the identity of Jesus, never unanimous agreement. But after the identity of Jesus was established, you start finding books that cohered with that sacred tradition about Jesus in the early churches. And the first is 360 CE, and then in Rome, 382, and then in Carthage in 393, actually Hippo in North Africa, and then Carthage in 397 and Carthage in 419. You start seeing the books. And interestingly, in 397 and 419, they also allowed reading in the churches the list of the martyrs. And So that was, you could read only those scriptures, but you could also read the list of martyrs. And to this day, the churches have followed that tradition every year. There's a time to remember the saints, those who passed away this current year. But in those days, it was the martyrs. The consistency in the lists varies. They overlap considerably with the Gospels and with Paul, but not all of Paul's writings. Sometimes they include the pastoral epistles and sometimes they don't. And they vary on some other books, like, as I mentioned, 3 Corinthians and the Repose of the Blessed Disciple that the Arminians included for centuries. So that varied for a period of time. And it was during that formative period, you found considerable overlap, the Gospels and Paul, and then lesser, the general epistles or the Catholic epistles, and the least of all quoted or cited and included in lists is the book of Revelation, which is the only book that claims to be a revelation from God in the New Testament, which I find that interesting. And churches have struggled with the book of Revelation forever, but they love to quote portions of it at funerals and various other special occasions, but it's a complex book.
What do you think caused the need to have a canonical Bible?
I think it was the results of heresies in the church wanted to address. They did that from the beginning with the sacred traditions that focused around Jesus in the churches. And then as time went on in the 2nd century, the church fathers would cite some of the writings, generally the Gospels, the sayings of Jesus, the words of Jesus. It's a technical term that's found in the 2nd century. They didn't cite, according to Matthew, Jesus said. They just said, Jesus said, and these are the words of Jesus. And as those books, the two most popular Gospels were Matthew and John, and Matthew by far more than any others was cited in the early church fathers. Luke and Mark were the least cited, but Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century clobbers Marcion because he said the Gospel of Luke was Paul's Gospel, and he excised references to the Old Testament scriptures at the time that were in it. And he did some cutting up of it, and he was excommunicated from the church. But there was no one that was saying all of these books, but the ones that were most commonly used in the churches and cited as authoritative began to be cited, and the order is always citations, and then they come to the idea, and that's because they were useful in the life of the church, and then they begin to be called scripture. And the Shepherd of Hermas, that is excluded in the Muratorian fragment, is cited as scripture by Irenaeus and several other church fathers, and it was included in Codex Sinaiticus. But some writings, Christian writings, had a temporary sacredness, scriptural status attached to them, like First Clement. Clement of Rome wrote it. So those are the kinds of things that led to widespread use. Was always first. And then as heresies begin to come forward and people are citing other books written in the names of apostles, they begin to say, no, not those books. Why? Because they don't affirm the sacred traditions that were about Jesus right from the very beginning. And there's overlapping coherence in the books that did make it into the New Testament, but there's some very orthodox books that were cited as scripture early, like the letters of Ignatius and like First Clement, and they were not accepted. But they were cited as scripture for centuries with some Christians. And bit by bit, it was over time, then the churches that were in dominant places began to, like the church at Rome in 382, they said these writings and no others could be cited as scripture in the churches. And others began to follow that, but not everybody. And the Syrian Christians said, no, we disagree with that. And for centuries longer. Eventually, the influence of Rome and the influence of the Greek tradition got into the Syrian tradition, and they adopted all of the books of the New Testament. But that took centuries. And again, the last one was about 7th or 8th century for the book of Revelation. Is that too much in the weeds, or is that...
Oh, no, I thought that was perfect.
Oh, good. Okay.
And my closing question, when did one single canon begin to dominate Christianity?
Well, if you're talking about one complete Bible, it never has. The Christians have never fully agreed on the scope of their Old Testament, and but most agree now on the scope of the New Testament. Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, and the Ethiopian Christians, who were isolated from the rest of Christendom for almost 1,000 years, they were evangelized by the Syrian Christians, and they have the largest collection of writings in their Bible, 81, and it includes First Enoch of all things, but it also includes some early councils. But it's the largest collection of Christian writings in a Bible. But again, there's considerable overlap, and when Christians from Catholic and Orthodox and Protestants get together, they generally focus on the scriptures they all hold in common, and they'll have their debates and fights later on the books that some affirm and some don't, like the deuterocanonical books. And the Russian Orthodox has third and fourth Maccabees included in their collection. The Catholics have first and second Maccabees, but there's a lot of valuable information in those books. So the Bibles are pretty well settled now for the Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Protestants. But that took many centuries to take place, and there were variations within the traditions for quite some time. I was in a congregational church back in the 1960s, and the pastor was an Emmanuel Arminian congregational church, Armenia, the country, and he still liked to cite the repose of the blessed disciple, even though it hadn't been in his Bible for almost 100 years. So it was an interesting time. But there are variations in the Christian scriptures, but there's considerable overlap in all of them. There's more overlap than there are differences, and the difference are like a handful of books on the side. So I encourage folks to look at the books that cohere with the sacred traditions. I wrote a book recently, it just came out this year, on before there was a Bible. And I focused on the fact, what did the Christians do before they had a New Testament or a complete Old Testament? They focused on the sacred traditions that circulated around Jesus, and those were affirmed in the teaching and the preaching of in the churches, as well as in their baptismal affirmations and in their Eucharistic affirmations when they would break bread together. And most churches cohered with the writings that cohered with that tradition. And in the 4th century, after the broad agreement on the identity of Jesus, there could not have been new books added after that, though there were some circulating in churches for centuries longer. But the ones that cohered with that broad collection of sacred tradition are the ones that were accepted, with a few exceptions. I find First Clement to be more informative and more useful than Second Peter. And it's much longer, and it has a lot more information, and it's the largest text that cites the Hebrew scriptures in the early church. And I'm teaching a class at a Presbyterian church right now, and I asked them, which Bible should we read? A translation of the Hebrew Scriptures or a translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures? They all wanted to have the Hebrew Bible. I said, but the earliest Christians, 70% of the time, cited the Greek Scriptures that at times are very much at odds with the Hebrew Scriptures. And a dear friend, Emmanuel Tov in Israel, came up to me. We were doing papers at a similar conference, and I mentioned the variations in the New Testament text, somewhere between minimally 200,000 of the existing manuscripts. And Bart Ehrman says maybe 400,000. I haven't counted all of them, but Tov came up and said, Lee, there's over 900,000 variants in the Hebrew manuscripts. And so there are times when he feels the Greek translation, when it coheres with the Hebrew, the Old Testament scriptures found at the Hebrew scriptures found at Qumran, he agrees with that and sides with the Greek and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also the Samaritan Pentateuch. If the Greek and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree, Tov says he's willing to follow that. So he's the gifted textual critic of the Old Testament scriptures, Hebrew scriptures. And I've had him in my home, I've been in his, and he always, whenever he speaks, I learn greatly from him. So anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Oh, I definitely thought it was. Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Lee McDonald.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.